so excited to be a part of this community as sort of resident facilitator. And I got interested in this work because I was really inspired by the notion that social justice and money management could actually coexist. I started my career in finance, although I've come a long way from there. And back in the day, it just didn't feel like that was possible. So I'm really inspired by the project that rises up to. I want to turn it over to Iris to introduce herself.
Awesome. Thanks, Sonia. I'm so glad to be doing this with you. I'm Iris Brilliant. I come to this work as a young person with wealth who inherited wealth when I turned 22. And immediately, the money I inherited was invested in really awful investments. And so for the last 8 or 9 years, I've been curious about and trying to find ways of shifting my money to be aligned with social justice values. And was lucky enough to discover this firm and get to find other values-aligned women and queer people who really deeply are committed to aligning our money with social change, and in particular with a lens around race. It is really meaningful to me. So I'm glad to be here as a consultant and be your co-host with Sonia.
Oh, I wanted to say one other thing is that we're going to be recording this call, so just in a moment, we're going to push that record button.
I want to pass it over to Rachel and Maya. Please tell us about yourselves and about the firm.
Great. Thanks, Iris and Sonia. I'm Rachel Robasciotti. I am the founder and CEO of Robasciotti Philipson, which is an independent progressive wealth management firm. We're based in San Francisco. We have clients all over the United States, and I'm the co-founder of RISE, which stands for Return on Investment and Social Equity. And I'm here with my business partner, Maya Philipson.
Hi, everyone. I'm Maya Philipson. I'm Rachel's business partner, and I just got off a flight and ran here literally because I took public transportation because Lyft and Uber are not running today. And so it's made my life very excited. So I'm thrilled to be here with you because it's the calmest I've been all day. Between Rachel and I think we've spent something like 35 years in the financial industry. Does that sound about right?
I've been in the industry 20 years personally.
I think I'm up to 14 or 15. So our firm has actually been in existence since 2004. We manage about $140 million, and the majority of our
of all of the staff in the firm are women of color,
which is pretty amazing for financial services. So we have women of color in all different places within our firm, from, of course, one of our glorious owners, through our advisors and our administrative staff.
And Iris and Sonia asked me to talk a little bit about my personal background and why I started the firm, which informs why we're doing some of this work. I grew up Black and poor in Oroville, California. If you don't know where that is, it's about 65 miles north of Sacramento. And it was really rural poverty. There was de facto segregation throughout my childhood. All the Black people lived on the south side of town. And as a result, as you can probably imagine, we faced many different problems, like the unfair incarceration of family members, homelessness, hunger, drugs, violence. And it was always really evident to me that what was at the root of the problems was the fact that we didn't have enough money, that we were poor. And really what was at the root of that was racism, because we were a Black family. And so I decided to work in financial services so that I could, of course, make enough money for myself and to support my family, but I also wanted to help other people. And I believed that money was a very powerful tool to make life better for communities like the one that I came from. But traditional finance wasn't really working out well for me. It actually made it harder for me at times to truly help people and make change. And some of you may be familiar with this statistic from the Knight Foundation, the study they put out in 2017, but firms that are owned by minorities and women manage only 1.1% of the financial industry's total $71.4 trillion in assets. And so if you can imagine if that number was 99%, we'd be living in an entirely different world, and we're doing our part. So you can imagine, like, I didn't see myself reflected. I didn't have a community. And the folks that I was working with weren't interested in social justice values. So at the age of 25, I started Robasciotti Philipson so that I could focus on what mattered most, which was building a pipeline for women, people of color, and other traditionally underrepresented groups, and then also doing work that actually had an impact on those communities. So we've been very successful at doing that too.
We've been very successful.
Yeah, so that's a little bit about my background.
Awesome, thank you. I was really glad to see there's a lot of folks on the call who are new to RISE, and I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit about RISE and how it got started.
Sure, let's see.
We would actually be very excited to, because we enjoy talking about RISE greatly.
Aha. And I'm just going to...
Now we're going to use technology.
Sure. Yeah, we'll see how this goes.
Hopefully.
I believe in you.
Thank you.
All right.
All right, so you should all be seeing a screen that says RISE, Return on Investment in Social Equity. If you are not, please make a note in the chat box.
Okay. So we always focus on socially conscious investing, but at the end of the Great Recession in 2010 and 2011, we started to notice a pretty disturbing trend. Actually, Maya and I were seated just like this at the desk, and we were looking at some of the funds in particular that our clients were invested in. This was one of the funds that we ended up looking at, and a very large fund, has $4 billion in it. And what we realized, because we dig a bit deeper, we went and looked at the holdings, something that's still the current reality today, which is that kind of if you go and look at the holdings and you dig a bit deeper than those just kind of like initial 5 that they show you, you can see that there's some very odd things in there for a socially responsible fund. So at the time we had noticed Exxon and Halliburton, and more recently when we did this research in order to show all of you, we noticed that there was Goldman Sachs and Occidental Petroleum. And Goldman Sachs is the one that put out a report that told their profile companies that curing patients wasn't a sustainable medical business model. So, along with other ways in which Goldman contributed to the financial crisis. This is my favorite example, which is Occidental Petroleum.
I have a little hate in my heart for Occidental Petroleum. So Occidental Petroleum, if you're not familiar with it, is a very large chemical corporation, and they are the reason that in today's world and in the EPA we have a Superfund program.
So says the Department of Justice.
Exactly, because Occidental Petroleum did something called the Love Canal incident, which you probably don't remember because it was in the late 70s. I had to look it up, but it involves more toxic waste than the EPA knew what to do with.
Right.
They're bad people.
We were pretty upset to find that, and what we had ultimately hoped was that we could continue working with some of the socially responsible investment options that were out there, but we were really kind of confused about what was happening, and we did some additional digging and found that it was actually as a result of hydraulic fracturing in North America, or oil sands work. You may have heard of it.
So you're probably all familiar with hydraulic fracturing or fracking. But basically, it's the idea that there's layers of oil in between sedimentary layers or in a sand, and so to get it out, you need to compress or add air to the earth and pump it out, which means you get pictures like the one on the screen.
Yeah. So all of the highest returning investments were in hydraulic fracturing in North America. And the socially responsible investment managers were pretty much locked out of investing in the entire oil and gas exploration sector. And so while other investment managers were getting the returns that they were looking for, the socially responsible managers were locked out of that. And so something really unfortunate started to happen, which is that they actually started to change the definition of what it meant to be a socially responsible investor in order to give them access to investing in this particular sector.
Now, if you know anything about finance, we're sad to say that this is a very common story. If you don't like something, just change the metric. And so what we saw is
you'll hear more about that later.
This will come back. So nothing gets mutual fund managers, the people who put and maintain mutual funds together fired faster than their portfolios not rebounding. And so instead of really holding on to their principles and not investing in oil and gas exploration, they just changed the metric.
They did. And ultimately, in changing their metric, what they did was they changed the social screen And the social screen is basically the set of non-financial investing criteria that you use. So of course you have your financial criteria. It's like, is this a decent company to invest in? Are they going to make money? And then you have your non-financial criteria, like, are they helpful or harmful to people on the planet? And so basically this definition started to change. It used to be that they were excluding the bad actors, and then they changed it to something called the best in class definition, which led to basically choosing the least bad actor, because they said, okay, in each sector, we're going to look at the most socially responsible company, even if that sector in and of itself is not socially responsible. So you end up with the most socially responsible oil and gas exploration companies. And currently, you'll hear best in class, but you'll also hear ESG, which stands for environment, social governance standards for evaluating investing. But whether you're hearing best in class or ESG, it means the same thing. It means that you are not doing an objective evaluation of the investments. And so Maya and I looked at this in community, actually, in our own investing community, and we were really looking at the problem and saying, okay, what's happening with socially responsible investment? Something that had happened from the very start is that the investment managers were the ones who chose the social screens, so they could actually end up changing them when those social screens didn't suit. And as a result, that's how we got these portfolios that aren't truly reflecting social justice values. Maya and I, having many years in social justice work, knew that things like this happen, for example, in philanthropy and in other areas, when those who are most impacted are not part of the decision-making process. And so we created something that was based on a social justice investing model. We're actually the folks that coined the term social justice investing. And with a community of people, we said, it shouldn't just be the investment manager who might have other reasons for choosing certain screens, like how easy is it to get the data, and is it going to be something that sells well to folks? So we said the investment managers can be included because they have some knowledge, but also it's really important to include social justice organizations and allies, as well as the investors themselves, because the investment managers and the investors had really lost alignment and what mattered most to them. Oop, going the wrong way. Okay, so that's basically how RISE got started. And let me just check here. And so in the process, what happened was we developed the first ever community created social screen.
And why that's particularly important is that often when we talk to some of our colleagues, which Rachel and I do on a fairly regular basis, we talk to other investment managers, one of the first things that they think when we talk about community is that our community are just our investors. But we have a little problem in America with a racial wealth divide. We have some other problems in America, but that's definitely one of them. And so it's very important that our community includes social justice organizations and allies. And it also includes investors. And so as we talk more specifically about race and racism in the investing world, and often how we came up with our social screens, you're actually going to hear a little bit in that story about what the social justice organizations and allies brought to the table that as investment managers and even just investors, we couldn't necessarily bring ourselves.
Right. So that's a little bit of the background, how we got started.
Thank you. And just to note, there's a couple folks on the phone, so as we go through the slideshow, if it makes sense to just name what we're looking at, that might be helpful for people on the phone.
Great, and feel free if you think that you want to name it too. We're totally down with that.
Cool. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the history of racism in the investing world so that we can better understand the context in which RISE came out of.
Absolutely. So we remember this slide about the socially responsible investing. It's really important to recognize that when this first started in the 70s is when it really started getting some traction. The investment managers were, of course, thinking about what would ultimately market well, because that matters. They wanted to get more investors, choosing them as investment managers, but they were really listening to the needs of the Christian Catholic and Protestant communities because it was a lot of their pensions and other funds that they had that were invested that they really wanted to align with their values, as well as the environmental movement was just really starting to take hold. And as we know from social justice work, it's the environmental movement as well as any values alignment with a Christian tradition. Those tend to be in the investing world overwhelmingly white. And so we were kind of coming out of those being the folks that the investment managers are thinking about as the very first screens were created. And this now basically guides the investing world. And this gets us into talking about something that Maya and I like talking about, which is metrics.
We are very focused on metrics. So one of the most important things to understand about social screens is that there's basically two types of social screens. There are things that you can measure with numbers, which we call our quantitative screens, and then there's our qualitative screens, which are things that are more difficult to measure that in terms of fact-based numbers. And those tend to be social issues. So let's talk about the environment for a second. As Rachel said, there was a big environmental movement that made its way into the investment management world in the 1970s. And so some of the oldest data that we have that we can use for social screening actually comes from years of study that environmentalists and environmental justice movements have done. So some of the best metrics we have are things around carbon emissions, deforestation, palm oil, things like that. Those are great screens. They're very objective, they're very good, they have a lot of data, but they don't necessarily take into account people. They just take into account the planet. And that is a problematic approach when we're trying to make a holistic social screen.
And given that race is not something that still a lot of people have comfort talking about in the United States, and particularly there's less comfort with it traditionally in white communities, this wasn't something that was in conversation with the investment management community.
And we know that that's a really big problem, because when we actually look at reports on climate change, when we look on reports of fracking or air pollution, what you'll see is that climate change in particular disproportionately affects communities of color. But
if you don't have a racial justice lens when you're taking a look at that environmental data, when you're looking at those metrics, then you really kind of miss a huge part of the whole reason why we're focusing our investments in this particular way. So we wanted to make sure that we were clear that ultimately the social justice organizations and allies, and also the RISE investors as a community, definitely have on their mind more so a more holistic approach. So not just catering to interests of one particular group, but with our social justice investing community, we have actually an entire set of social screens that cover various different aspects of both how investing can impact people and the planet. And we're working always to create more and more metrics for racial justice and to incorporate that into the portfolios. That's a big piece of it.
Cool, which we'll get to talk about in more detail in a little bit. Can you tell us more about your theory of change regarding corporations and influencing corporate behavior, and also why you decided to invest in publicly traded companies, including neutral ones?
That's actually a question that we get a lot. This is our theory of change. Iris loves this. So thank you for the question. So this is basically our theory of change. When you look at all of the different things that you can do with money, on one extreme end, you can give it all away, which doesn't have very much of a financial return for you, but it has a high social return. And on the other end of the spectrum, you really can take money from other people. Or if you are the United States, you can steal land and labor from Black and brown people and become the most successful country on the planet. Same is true with corporations. There are companies that fall all along this spectrum, and anywhere going toward crime on this right side of the spectrum, our theory is that we want to divest and we want to educate other people about divesting from these companies. We don't actually want to increase the share price and make the people that own those shares wealthier and give those companies more assets to work with. We have a strong ethos around giving and actually supporting in the realm of philanthropy. And then there's this sweet spot here, and I'll talk a bit more about why, with publicly traded companies, where we really want to invest and influence these actors. And publicly traded companies are some of the largest actors that exist. For example, I think one of my favorite examples is that when Google decided to go 100% renewable, that removes 5 million tons of carbon, and that's like taking 1 million cars off the road, which is a lot different than having, than one person taking action. So we're actually following kind of like, who are the largest actors, and how can we get the largest actors to move when it comes to social justice, which includes climate justice as well. So there are some people that really feel like working with publicly traded companies is in and of itself a negative, and I actually disagree with that. In the new economy, we need, I heard this in a podcast, in the new economy, we need midwives and we need those who are doing hospice work. So the midwives are the people who are creating the brand new ways of working that are non-extractive, and we also need to work with the older models to make sure they aren't doing harm and encourage them, influence them more toward making positive social change. So that's why we work with publicly traded companies. Was that a satisfying answer, Iris?
I found that extremely satisfying.
Okay.
I was actually taking some notes because there were some other great things there. Thank you.
Okay.
Cool. So we're here to talk about racial justice in particular. Can you tell us about how RISE aligns its investments with racial justice, and just tell us more about the racial justice screen and how it was developed?
Yes, and we like talking about racial justice and our racial justice screen a lot because it's one of the most comprehensive in the industry.
It is the most comprehensive racial justice screen that exists.
It is the most comprehensive.
Hopefully not for long. We are in the process of influencing other people to adopt a similarly robust screen. This is a picture of our social screen, and most social screens are just a list of things that investment manager is screening for. And they don't really tell you exactly what it means to screen for those particular things. But ours is actually put into context because this is what we actually got from the community that ended up becoming RISE, was that this really has to be in the context of supporting people and the planet. My PowerPoint, of supporting people on the planet. And if we're supporting people on the planet, then what we're doing is seeking well-being for all of the for all of the inhabitants of the planet, as well as the physical and social well-being for the people. And that means we're going.
Oh, sorry. If this is hard for folks to see, you can also look at our website that has the screens on here as well.
Thanks. It's true. And we're going to zoom in here in a moment. And so if we're going to support people on the planet and seek well-being, then we need to promote certain corporate behavior. We need to make sure they have safe products and business practices. So you can see there's an entire list here where we go through corporate citizenship, human rights, clean air and water, etc. But because we're looking at influencing these companies that we're invested in toward more socially responsible behavior, toward an alignment with social justice values, we actually come up with this social screen as a result. And we can zoom in to take a closer look at our racial justice screens. And for most folks in the industry, private prisons and maybe prison labor are a part of their screens, but because of the wisdom of community, we're actually able to come up with a more comprehensive screen that includes systemic racism, the money bail system. We actually have found ways to starve them, to begin a process of starving the money bail system of its capital, predatory lending, for-profit colleges, which disproportionately harm people of color, supporting Indigenous peoples' rights, like some of the work that we did around the No DAPL for the Dakota Access Pipeline Project, and also ensuring that there's equal employment opportunity in the companies that we're invested in, so that companies are always moving forward in those particular ways.
Exactly. And this is where you'll start to see some of the things that I was mentioning earlier when I was talking about data. Because one of the reasons that Rachel highlighted that other investment managers don't have perhaps as systematic racial justice screens is obviously because they're not in community and talking to their community about what's actually important to them. The other reason is because certain of these things are much easier to get data on than others.
True.
There's really actually, it's really fairly easy to figure out who owns and operates private prisons. It's slightly harder, but still doable to figure out what companies use prison labor in the manufacture or distribution of their products.
True, and it was incredibly difficult to figure out how the money bail system was actually connected to publicly traded companies.
Incredibly difficult.
But we were able to work with some folks over at the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers, and to really refine that screen. Strangely enough, the money bail system, those bail bonds are actually backed by insurance policies. And those insurance policies are written by insurance companies that are owned by larger insurance companies that trade on the public exchanges.
The things you learn as an investment manager. Money bail is an insurance product.
Yeah. But the way that we created our racial justice screen was in collaboration and learning from many different organizations that are in anti-racism work. Color of Change really informs us a lot on the money bail system, the Movement for Black Lives, and the Corrections Accountability Project, which was out of the Urban Justice Center and recently became their own entity, Worth Rises. They've done a ton of work on divestment from the prison industrial complex, though not just the private prisons, but also the companies that are the suppliers for private prisons. So we're really trying to cut off funding for private prisons as they disproportionately incarcerate Black and Brown people. So we've been able to do that work as well. And then in addition to really developing these screens in community with social justice organizations and allies, we also leverage the power of being an investment manager and working with other investment managers to make change. We're part of the Racial Justice Investing Coalition, which is a group of fierce, wonderful investment professionals that also have this racial justice lens. And sometimes we're able to all move toward divestment. Sometimes we're able to actually support organizations that are doing particular work that's in the same vein. Most recently, we've been consulting with the Harvard Prison Divestment Project. It's a group of students at Harvard that is working toward getting their $40 billion endowment to divest from private prisons. And they've been making some headway, so we're happy to support them as well. So, and our racial justice work isn't just, we're creating screens, because things that are measured do matter, especially in the investing world. But it's not just that. It's also how can we leverage the power of being investment managers who manage $140 million. How can we leverage our knowledge in the investment world and the connections that we have to work in coalition to make change as well.
And we were talking about why we focus on public companies, and part of the reason also as opposed to private companies, which we didn't really get to talk about, but the idea is that they're privately owned. Public companies have shareholders, and companies are actually quite responsive to their shareholders or to the power of investment or divestment. One of the big wins that we had was General Electric. They actually divested from a company that is now called CoreCivic. It used to be called the Corrections Corporation of America. And when a company as big as General Electric divests, what that means is they divested, is it $78 million?
$78 million.
$78 million.
Yeah.
That's a lot of money.
Absolutely.
That's some change.
Yeah. And a lot of the other wins you may be familiar with, if you're queer, part of the queer community, the fact that we had domestic partner benefits before we really had domestic partnership elsewhere, or even marriage. A lot of the fact that most companies had domestic partner benefits was directly a result of investors bringing actions in those corporations and making that change. So big props to Shelley Alpern, who did a lot of that work and is a mentor in this space. But it's those types of changes that we're seeking to make by really being racial justice investors, not just the screening.
And we do think that's best done in coalition, which is how we end up also with our friends in the Racial Justice Investing Coalition. Because if you remember Rachel's theories of change, there are some people in that Racial Justice Investing Coalition that invest in companies that don't fit our social screens. And they want to talk to them, and they want to work with the ExxonMobils and the Halliburtons and the Smith & Wessons of the world. And we can support them. And when we divest, they can support us.
Yeah.
So we are all stronger together.
Thanks. Can you tell us about what supply chain work is and why that is important?
Absolutely. So when we talk about supply chain, we talked a little bit about this earlier. We're talking about the companies that are part that may not be directly delivering services, for example, of private prisons, but we're talking about the companies that, for example, deliver food services or provide telephone services, those types of things. And this is something that's really particularly interesting. And if I can figure out the technology here, I kind of want to show you a real world example of like a lot of socially responsible managers recently have, let's see if I can share this. A lot of socially responsible managers have, where am I? It's right there. Okay. Have figured out that they will not do well if they have Geo or CoreCivic in their portfolios, right? So this is a very large investment manager, and this is a third-party website, and we want to be clear that we're not endorsing these folks or representing anything else about them, except that we want to show you how to actually look deeper inside of what you own to see if racial justice is something that's showing up in your portfolio. So let's see. This is a large fund of theirs, just about 300 million in it. And taking a look at the portfolio, usually you click on portfolio or holdings or something like that, we start to see the companies that are here. And you may not see Geo or CoreCivic, but when you really start to look at all of the companies that are the constituents, you start to scroll through a little bit.
Well, our friend Goldman Sachs.
Yes, there's Goldman Sachs.
I haven't looked at this one lately.
Where's my Aramark?
Oh.
Aramark does a ton of the food in private prisons. They're actually like a major contractor there. And so we see Aramark, and as I'm scrolling through this, you folks are probably also seeing some companies that you wouldn't necessarily consider socially responsible, and this is one of the largest socially responsible managers.
And you're probably seeing some that you would consider socially responsible. It's hard. Aramark is in there though.
It is Aramark and CenturyLink.
Can I talk about CenturyLink?
You can. All while right. I do a
I'm
find.
a little obsessed with CenturyLink. All right, so
there's Aramark.
CenturyLink is a perfectly nice.
There we go, and there's CenturyLink.
CenturyLink is a perfectly nice telecom. If you live anywhere in the sort of center of the country, the Midwest, you may have received services from CenturyLink. A tiny itsy bitsy fractional bit of CenturyLink is a division that works directly with prisons, and they provide video conferencing and telephone services to prisons. And it is CenturyLink, you would think it's such a small part of the total that is CenturyLink that they would be more than willing to give up this tiny little fraction of their company because they're getting not enough, but some pressure from shareholders and outside groups.
Yes.
Except
the ICCR, the Interfaith Coalition for Corporate Responsibility, they are some amazing nuns. I never knew I'd have so much in common with nuns.
Nuns.
They are
hammering away.
Filed multiple shareholder resolutions just to have them get rid of this particular line of business.
But they won't do that.
No, they won't. They won't do it, and so they aren't in our portfolio.
They aren't in our portfolio, and the reason they won't do it is because it makes so much money. Because if you've ever been involved in talking to anyone or receiving any calls from within the prison system, the charges are incredibly expensive. incredibly expensive. And so this tiny little division of CenturyLink makes so much money off incarcerated individuals that despite the feisty nuns pressing on them, they are not willing to give it up. And so we screen out CenturyLink as well as Aramark, and as well as several other large corporations that work directly with the prison industrial complex.
And we do, there's different ways of doing this. There's divestment, but also the ICC are lovely. They're not all nuns, but they're a great deal of nuns there. Best. You do. They're on it with racial justice, interestingly enough. What they do is they instead purchase nominal holdings, like a small holding, a couple $1,000s that will actually let them do things like say, hey, I'm a shareholder of this corporation. We want you to make this change. And we're able to do that. They're able to do that. And then similarly, they can gather together the assets of everyone that's not invested in the racial justice investing coalition and say, hey, and look, if there's this huge pool of money where you pass all of their other screens, but you just have this one tiny line of business, wouldn't you want your share price to increase? And wouldn't you want to do better if you just got rid of this one line of business? So those are some of the other ways that we're working on racial justice as well. But I just did that give you a good example of what it looks like to work with the supply chain? Because you can't run a private prison if you don't have contractors. So we're trying to cut off those contractors too.
Yeah. And we do supply chain work and, use this analysis beyond just the prison.
We do.
We particularly do it in our racial justice screen. We also do it very, very focused in oil and gas. That's another screen where we can pretty clearly trace the supply chain, and we want to screen out a lot of those companies.
It's true.
Excellent. Thanks. So why did you decide to have RISE be community controlled, and what does that look like on a practical level? And why should non-investors get to decide how to invest money?
That's a good question. Well, we originally thought about it just being the investors, and we realized that if social justice investing as a model is something that was going to actually become more widespread, our particular set of investors is incredibly diverse and is super informed and educated and has fantastic values. But we were like, if social justice investing is going to spread, we really needed to make sure that, again, the decisions weren't being made by those who are on the winning side of the racial wealth divide, because there wouldn't be a similar kind of focus on racial justice and many of the other issues that we care about. And so it was really just going back to our social justice values about those who are the most impacted are the ones who should be at the table. So there were no tables where that could happen, so we built one. That's what RISE is.
Yeah, we also saw a lot of when we started focusing, as Rachel said, on the model. We have people in power in this country that have historically been in power. And what we see is that those people in power keep replicating the same systems over and over again. We have more and more rich, older, white men making choices as they've done in this country for several hundred years. And so it wouldn't, as Rachel said, we have an amazing, wonderful, diverse community, but we also have a racial wealth divide. And so if we simply let investors be the ones who are sort of calling the shots and making all the decisions, what we fear is that some of those historical patterns will just continue to replicate themselves. And to really break that chain, we need to invite people who have never, ever had seats. They need to bring their own chairs, and we need to help.
Yeah, that's what we say. We're going to have to build the table and help people bring the chairs to the table as well. So we actually do a lot of outreach with our social justice organizations and allies to make sure they're there. We also want people who are investing to be able to do that, even if they are at what in our industry is considered one of the lower levels of the investing area. So our minimum for investing in RISE, we strategically lowered it to $50,000. And when we first launched RISE, we got it as low as we possibly could at that time, which was $100,000. And now we got it down to $50,000 because that ensures that the investors who are in the room as well are more likely to be diverse folks who care about their own personal return, of course, but are really dedicated to having that money work for their social justice values.
Yeah, and we want to get more people in the market, particularly women, particularly people of color, who may not have not always have access to great wealth, but part of the way that you build wealth is through investing and through the market and through financial literacy and having that sort of hands-on experience of growing wealth. And if we didn't have a lower investment minimum, that wouldn't necessarily be possible.
It's true.
Thanks. And just so folks know, I'm just going to ask a couple more questions and then we'll transition to a Q&A.
Mm-hmm.
So connected to this piece around staying accountable to social justice movements and other communities, in what ways are you responsive to campaigns and social justice movement work and adaptive in your screens?
Well, one example that about this time last year, the movement for our lives had just come up, or it just happened in March. And one of the things that had come out of the Parkland shooting, one of the things that was being requested was for divestment from the companies that supported the NRA. And in our industry, weapons and firearms screens are pretty standard. That was one of the things that very early on the investment managers figured out folks wanted, but they didn't have anything to do with the NRA, and we understand what the NRA has actually become in our country. And so really really listening to them and wanting to incorporate support for social justice movements in the work that we do, we actually expanded our weapons and firearms screens to do additional research for like who's supporting the NRA as well. We're very into cutting off the money supply where we can.
We're very supply chain focused when
Yes.
we can be in certain areas.
Yeah.
Can I talk about borders?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I have become, again, as an investment manager, I never knew that I could have so much fun researching these things. So I've recently become obsessed with the militarization of borders and the immigration system.
Yeah, and that's actually part of our racial justice screen. It actually falls within our prison divestment piece, is really the incarceration of immigrants. And we're fleshing out an even more full immigration screen that includes this militarization of borders, but the data, those metrics aren't already out there.
Yeah.
And so we're building them.
Exactly. So we're co-authoring a study particularly on borders and particularly about the militarization of borders. Turns out there aren't actually that many militarized borders throughout the world, and we are building a militarized border on our southern border with Mexico. So if you talk to the academics, they'll tell you it's a great time to study militarization of borders. I'm not quite as excited as they are, but they also need our help and support and funding. So we're co-authoring a study on that. And
just so we can understand like what companies are profiting from this and how can we make sure that the rest of the world knows about it too.
Yeah. And
so that divestment can happen there as well.
I'll give you a sneak peek that I'm sure you're shocked to hear about, is that the same companies that do internal policing are also getting into the business of ICE detention and border militarization.
Yep.
Shocker. So we're also looking at different ways that we can create screens around surveillance and policing technology, which is an emerging sort of part of border, but also prison militarization, as more and more people are released from prison to electronic monitoring.
In their own homes, which is just sadistic.
Yeah. And the American Friends Service Committee, which we have mentioned multiple times.
And Dalit Baum.
Dr. Dalit Baum, who we're big fans of, she's particularly very focused on surveillance. So we're helping.
What is your vision for how other wealth managers and investors might take on a commitment regarding racial justice?
The biggest thing that you can do is move to a model where those who are most impacted are setting your screens. Because if what you actually want is racial justice, then you need to have Black and brown people in the room helping you figure out what that means. The fact that even within our socially responsible investing industry, there was a huge study that was put out recently showing how white even the SRI world is. If we think that, a room full of people that traditionally have held power and have been on the winning side of the racial wealth divide, if we think that they're the best folks to make decisions, we aren't going to actually end up with racial justice the way that we want it showing up in the world. So I think having more of a community-based model, getting those people to the table, using prison divestment screens. It used to be just a few years ago, it wasn't even possible to know what companies were involved in the private prison industry, and that work has really been fleshed out. So that's something that's easy to incorporate into a portfolio. If you're an investment manager, we really highly recommend Ethic Investments. We're on the leading edge of many of their social screens, and we've given them permission to share some of the research that has gone into creating our screens with the other investment managers.
What are some basic things that individual investors and activists can do to assess if their investments are, involved in these systems of racism and violence?
Absolutely. So probably the easiest thing that you can start off by doing is just figuring out what's in your portfolio. It sounds basic, but a lot of people who we talk to just haven't taken the time or have the interest to look at all of the holdings in their portfolio. So it's actually easy.
And hopefully when you go back and look at the recording, you can see how easy it was for us to just a lot of people own mutual funds, just to go to the mutual fund website, go to the holdings or the portfolio page and just scroll and compare that, right, with a good data source. Like Worth Rises is a great place to find more information about companies connected to the prison industrial complex.
Exactly. So look for prisons, look for guns, look for pipelines, all of the things that you can kind of pick out by eye that you might not be comfortable with. And particularly also do this with retirement funds. So even if you don't necessarily feel you have wealth or access to wealth, many people still have the ability to invest in something like a 401k through their work, a 457 plan, a 403b, depending on where you work. And often there are, again, mutual funds offered through that. And so take a look at the holdings of those funds. If you don't like them, you can ask your employer to actually switch funds if necessary.
Yeah, and support the financial institutions that are taking a stand. I know it's really hard for me to talk about supporting these financial institutions, but if you're trying to choose between a particular financial institution, for example, it's good to know that JP Morgan Chase just divested from private prisons, which is huge because these private prison companies depend upon financing from the large banks. So the Racial Justice Investing Coalition, in collaboration with Make the Road in New York and Freedom Cities, actually do a lot of that work to really get JP Morgan, a traditional investment manager, to divest. So being involved in the social justice organizations that are doing this work as an individual is also something that you can do.
Awesome. Thank you both so much.